Okay, so let's take a look at a bunch of examples. Sketch y equals -3 sine of x using the 5 key points. So what I would do here is, I notice that I only have a change in the amplitude or vertical stretch and shrink with a reflection. So I'm going to go ahead and see that my period's going to be 2 pi, right? Because your b value is 1, period is just 2 pi. So I know it's going from 0 to 2 pi. And notice that each increment, right, the way you find that is you take the period and you divide into 4, right? Because we have 4 intervals here. 1, 2, 3, 4. We want to take the period, divide by 4, and that'll tell you what number to add by each time. So period divided by 4 is your increment. So in this case, it's just 2 pi divided by 4. Okay, which is pi over 2. So I'm going to have 0, pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is pi, or 2 pi over 2, right? And then I get 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. Basically the quadrangles of a unit circle going in the positive direction. Now let's go ahead and label the y-axis. Notice that my amplitude is +3, so I'm going to label it 3 and -3, because it's going to be amplified by a factor of 3. Instead of going to 1 and -1, it goes 3 and -3. Okay, now let's go ahead and sketch this. This is a sine graph, so it's the one where you start at the x-intercept. But notice, because it's negative, instead of going up to the maximum, we are going to go down to the minimum first, then intercept, maximum, intercept. So here is my final sketch. If I were to label the 5 key points, it would look like the following: 0, 0, pi over 2, -3, pi 0, 3 pi over 2, comma 3, right? And 2 pi, comma 0. Let's go ahead and sketch y equals sine of x over 2. Notice that sine of x over 2 is really sine of 1/2 times x. So my b value there is 1/2. I know I need a y max here, y min here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 intervals for my basic parent function that I'm going to use. And because I have a b value, my period is going to be different. Remember, period is 2 pi over b. So it's 2 pi divided by 1/2. Which is 2 pi multiplied by the reciprocal. So 4 pi is going to be the length of one full cycle. So I'm going from 0 to 4 pi. Notice that the increment, this one's pretty easy, right? You take the period and divide by 4, so I'm going to add by pi each interval. Again, notice that my cycle, full cycle, is 0 to 4 pi because it's 4 pi in length. And then if I divide that into 4 even slices, it's going to be pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. They're 1 pi long per interval here, per increment. In the y direction, because my a value was 1, I'm going between 1 and -1. Recalling that this is a positive sine graph, I start at the intersect, go to max first, intercept, minimum, and then intercept again. And I can go ahead and connect the dots, right? So that's the basic shape that we have, and that is my final answer. Let's take a look at this example here. Y equals 1/2 cosine of the quantity x minus pi over 3. So I notice that I have a value that's different, so vertical shrink by 1/2, and I have a phase shift. I'm going right pi over 3. I can see that it's right pi over 3 because it's a 1 there. I don't need to factor anything out to see that it's going to be right pi over 3. Let's go ahead and label some stuff to help us organize our ideas. My amplitude is 1/2. My period is going to be 2 pi over b, but my b is just 1, so period is 2 pi. That means my increment, how much I'm going to add each increment in the x direction, is 2 pi over 4, or pi over 2. Notice that I have a phase shift. So I have a phase shift, a horizontal shift. I'll abbreviate that with PS. And the way we find that is by taking the entire inside, right, and setting equal to 0. So x is equal to pi over 3. I'm going right pi over 3. So pi over 3 is going to be the new starting point in terms of the x direction. Again, for this particular case, we could see that it's going right pi over 3. Okay, so here we are going to graph phase shift pi over 3. So I'm going to start at pi over 3. Notice that's a little bit different. So this is like my new XY axis right here. I'm starting at pi over 3 because I have a horizontal shift or a phase shift. I'm going to need 1, 2, 3, 4 intervals total. My amplitude is 1/2, so it's going between positive 1/2 and negative 1/2. So I need to figure out how I'm going to label these x coordinates here, right? I know the entire length, one period or one cycle, is 2 pi units long. I found the increment, right, by dividing to 4 even slices. I know I'm adding pi over 2 each time. So this here is pi over 2, that's pi over 2, pi over 2, pi over 2. So what I need to do is go from pi over 3 and add pi over 2. Notice that I had to get common denominators to add the two fractions, so I get 5 pi over 6. So this next tick mark would be 5 pi over 6. And again, I have to add pi over 2. But notice pi over 2 is the same as 3 pi over 6. So if I add 3 pi over 6 here, I get 8 pi over 6. Add another 3 pi over 6 and I get 11 pi over 6. Add another 3 pi over 6 and I get 14 pi over 6. Note that you can reduce the 8 pi over 6 to 4 pi over 3 and the 14 pi over 6 to 7 pi over 3, but you don't have to reduce. You will still get full credit if you just keep your answers this way. So now we're finally going to sketch this. We have a positive cosine graph. Remember, positive cosine, you start at the max, right? So remember, this is my new xy axis for graphing purposes. So I start at my max, go to intercept, go to my min, intercept, and max. So here is my sketch, and I put double arrows at the end to show that they continue forever on either side. Go ahead and find the amplitude of this for me. Amplitude is the positive a value, or the vertical stretch or shrink factor, so that is 3. Now find the period of this function. So the period is 1. Remember, period is 2 pi over b, and the b is the number right in front of x. So it's the coefficient of x is always your b value. So when I do 2 pi divided by 2 pi, I get 1. Again, remember that period and amplitude both need to be positive in value. Go ahead and tell me the increment in the x direction. So how much would you have to add to move along the x-axis? All right, the increment is going to be the period divided by 4, so it's going to be 1/4, right? So you're going to add, right, every time you move here, you're going to add a fourth, right? So add a fourth, add a fourth, add a fourth. Because it totals, right, if you have 4 fourths, you get a total of 1. Now go ahead and find the phase shift. So the phase shift, you can set the entire inside of the cosine or sine function set equal to 0 and solve for x. So we get -2. That means you move left 2 units. Another way to do this is to think of factoring out the b value. So if I factor out the b value, which is the coefficient of x, if I factor out 2 pi, I would end up with x plus 2. And so notice, right, it's in factored form, therefore left 2 would be your phase shift. Alright, so let's go ahead and graph this. I know I'm going left 2, so I'm going to start here. That's -2. And my amplitude is 3, so I'm going up 3, down 3. So anytime I have a phase shift that's to the left, I actually find it easier to wait to stick in the y-axis there. Because we want to know where exactly to draw in the y-axis. So right here, this is like our new xy axis. I need to go 1, 2, 3, 4 intervals. 4 intervals or increments. So I'm starting at -2 and I need to add by 1/4 each time. So -2 plus 1/4, right? That would give me -7/4. Then I add another fourths and I get -6/4, then -5/4, and -4/4, which is really -1. So, you know, from -2 to -1 is 1 unit long, and that's our period. So that means my 0, right, would be somewhere over here. So I'm going to stick that 0 over here and place that y-axis there. So it's going between, again, 3 and -3. Okay, right, because all my negative numbers lie to the left of my y-axis, which goes through 0. Alright, so we have a negative cosine graph. So negative cosine is the one where you start at the minimum. So I'm going to start at the minimum value here, right? go to intercept, go to my max, intercept, and minimum. So here is my final sketch. Again, I'm just showing a portion of my graph because it repeats indefinitely of my negative cosine function. I have a minimum at -2, -3, and at -1, -3. I have my maximum point at -6/4, 3, and my two intercepts at -7/4, 0, and -5/4, 0. I want to mention here, when you are saying your phase shift, you can either just say x equals -2, or you can say left 2, right? Left 2, or you can say -2. Those will mean the same thing for me.